Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. Today, we have a group of people. That group of people is called our Pastoral Team here at Veritas Academy. Now, that does not mean that each of them is a small p pastor. They're not church officers here, although some might be serving in some church offices at other places. But really, it's a task here at Veritas of shepherding, of counseling, of being that person that comes alongside a student. All of our students are growing towards something, and we want them to grow toward Jesus Christ. So today we're going to talk about Christ-centered discipline here at Veritas that aims at restoration. But first off, folks, I want to take a moment here to thank our season sponsor, Hershey Financial Advisors, a wealth management firm located at North Point Boulevard in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, leading people to make better financial decisions and empowering them to fulfill a vision beyond themselves. Now, I'm going to introduce our guests and have them say hello. All of them are guests that, if you are a fan of the Cultivate podcast, you should know them already. So we're going to start by going to the right. Please introduce yourself and tell us what your role is here at the school.
I'm Rachel Kiehl, and I'm the Director of Counseling.
My name is Dan Spanjer, and I'm the principal here at Veritas.
And Graham Dennis, and I'm Dean of Students and an instructor.
Okay. So discipline is it's not a dirty word here at Veritas. In fact, it's, there are those times when you realize that words are linguistically connected. I remember once when I was praying for humility, and I realized that there was a linguistic connection between the word humility and the word humiliation. And I said, maybe not. Maybe, or as
you'd like it not to be.
As Augustine said, please answer my prayers, but not yet. Not yet, Lord. So discipline is really connected to that word discipleship. So we're going to try to wade into this area, and it's an area that's really important for parents in our culture today. As we start to talk about it, talk about how, if you could, how discipline and discipleship are related here at Veritas and in the Bible. I'm going to go to Graham first for this because he had a Bible passage already.
It's actually one of the first verses I memorized when I came to Christ. And so it's Hebrews 12:11. So the verse, this is the New King James. It says, "Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So there's two interesting concepts there. One is it's going to seem painful. So Hebrews says it does not seem joyful in the present. It seems painful. But then the second is that the fruit of it is righteousness and peace. And notice, though, the key word here is for those who've been trained by it. So I think the point you were making, Ty, is that the word disciple is hidden in the word discipline. Mm-hmm. And so here we have in Hebrews 12:11, trained. So the idea is that discipline is a kind of training.
Yeah. Anybody else want to speak to that? How discipline and discipleship fit together? So do we just do like painful things to students because all painful things are positive? Is that what Graham's getting at?
No, I think it can feel that way. We live in a culture where pain is oftentimes associated with bad things, limitation, a constricting of personal potential. And I think the relationship with God always is that we need to grow and change, and that's difficult, and that comes with pain. So not all pain is good, but not all pain is bad. And I think sometimes the pain that actually teaches you how to grow in Christ, or in anything, in athletics, pain is going to be a positive thing. I think one of the weird things about this discipline in this group in the pastoral team is that there's always the component of the hard discipline, and it's got to be a consequence. You can't do this, or you receive pain. But then there's the time to counsel and grow them up. Those two both belong together. I tend in my role be more of the, I've got to draw the hard line and I've got to bring the consequence to bear. But that's not all that we do. That's to help you refocus on, what you're doing and who you are. And then the pastoral team comes around the student and prays and works so that that discipline has good fruit and bears good fruit in the student's lives.
Yeah. So what Dan said is that this discipline is taking place. And this is where I see a little bit of a shift in parenting over the 150 years I've been the head of school here at Veritas. But a shift in that I think there's discipline, like Dan said, that's going to be painful. And that oftentimes I see parents react negatively to causing pain in a way that, as a dad 25 years ago, we're almost to post-dad status or post-dad with
Dad
kids
disciplinary.
with kids in the house status, but in a way that probably Emily and I didn't react negatively to that. But there's also this context of love in which that has to happen. So our pastoral team tries to hit both sides of that. So talk about, Rachel, you're probably, as the director of counseling, and that, by the way, director of counseling, as you'll remember, podcast fans, that means that she does a lot for college counseling here at Veritas. So you're probably on more of that second part of discipline, not the not the drawing of the tight lines like Dan said, but or the clear lines, but really that context of love, which parents seem to still get that, but the two things really have to work together.
Yeah.
So explain that coming around the student that you might be involved in.
Well, I think when we see an incident happen or a behavior, you could say, that brings on the discipline and negative behavior, my counseling training is always going to thinking about what caused that, like what's the root, what's beneath the surface of that behavior that we saw. And I like to have the opportunity to sit down with a student and think through what might be causing that and consider with them how that could change.
Yeah.
So,
and I want to make sure people get a clear idea of what we do and what we don't do here at Veritas. Because as I tell new families when I'm meeting with them, I say, Veritas is full of sinners. And because of that, if you are sinless, we'd really like you not to come to Veritas Academy because we just don't think you're going to be a really great fit here. We know one sinless person and we like him, but that's enough. We don't need any other sinless people here, and you're going to be really disappointed in us. But what we do is Rachel is handling counseling needs that are on a very garden variety basis. We take really serious counseling needs, which sometimes come up with our students, and we really farm those out to professionals. So I don't want people to think that sometimes I've been around schools that have had like a whole team of psychologists. We have a line that we draw to say, how do you make that decision?
Yeah. So I would definitely say school counseling is not therapy. And any school counseling program anywhere, Christian school or not, that's not how a school counselor is trained. We are trained to do crisis intervention and solution-focused counseling. So solution-focused counseling would look like this happened. What are some solutions right now that could be implemented to ensure this doesn't happen again or to help you along in this area in your life? And those are the conversations I would have with a student. I think a way to delineate when does a student need more help would be when you're really seeing a behavior or an attitude impact a student's well-being and their ability to function in life. And if a certain way of thinking or behaving is really impacting a student's ability to come to school, to do their schoolwork, to do what we need to do as a school, then that's when I'd say, let's start looking at who professionally might be able to come alongside and give some deeper help. And even then, I would say to parents, I think some have the idea that like you're committing to this lifelong therapeutic relationship. I would say absolutely not. Like find a Christian counselor who's going to work with you as the parent towards solutions for your child. And maybe that's help for a couple of months.
Yeah.
You want to take the training wheels off and say, here's some strategies you might be thinking about this wrong. Let's work on this together, and definitely include the parents as part of that process.
Okay, that's a great answer. I want to turn the conversation a little bit. Let's start at kind of the pinnacle or the aim of discipline here at Veritas. How, as you as a pastoral team think about that, what do we want out of a student here at Veritas to say that student is on a path toward being what we're aiming at as a pastoral team?
I think there's two things. First of all, the passage I read suggests that the fruit of discipline is peace and righteousness, but a really simple way to think of it is maturity. That, everything
and our culture is full of peace and righteousness.
Yeah, right.
We do it really well.
I mean, in a way, everything that we're doing is aimed at maturity.
Yeah.
We want the students to be more mature writers. We want them to be more mature readers. We want them to be more mature citizens.
Yeah.
So the training is always about maturity. When you read Proverbs, that this is the goal of all discipline, is to bring someone to maturity. So, but the other thing is that we believe that biblically, maturity is peace. If by growing into the people God wants us to be, there's actually peace. So we could say that the aim of discipline is maturity, but you could also say it's flourishing. Because we live in a culture that doesn't point them to maturity. And therefore, it's not pointing them to flourishing. So the aim is for children to flourish. And it's so amazing when you see, I just got to see one of our former students, Annie Hoover, come back with her little baby. And Annie is flourishing.
Yeah, no.
This is a person who's...
So I'm over here. You can't see my face, of course, but I'm smiling. And it's just the words Annie Hoover that just make my my face just smile. And maybe that's the goal of discipline here at Veritas.
Picture of Annie Hoover.
No. Just those being that kind of mature person that the godly adults in your life can't help but smile when they think about those steps that you've taken. Yeah.
Can I add one thing there? Because I think that's great, Graham. And that is, when we think of it as a pastoral team, we meet around someone, we're keeping that focus. It's not, I think a lot of people think it's punitive. How can we stop this student? It's not punitive and negative. We're actually looking at flourishing. But there's another dimension to that same argument. We want to see the student do well, but we want to see the school do well. So I think we're always having to balance what's the best way we can serve the student and what's the best way we can serve. Because the point of peace is not just an individual being peaceful, it's the community around that student being at peace.
Those are some of the toughest things we have to work through on the admission side, because sometimes we come to a point and say, Veritas might be really a blessing to this student, but it's that student is going to bring with them something that we just can't handle in the community.
Yeah.
And our first responsibility on the who comes in the door kind of thing is we have to think about the health, not just of the individual, but of the whole community. Sometimes those are really, really tough things, and I know that you all have been involved in some of those conversations.
That's really well said, Ty. Thank you for that summary. And I just want to commend my two colleagues here, because that's a lot of what goes on in our meetings. There's just a lot of hard conversations about getting that right. And it's not easy, but it's prayerfully done and it's done thoughtfully. So thank you, Ty. That's a good summary.
So when we think about that partnership between parents and faculty members and staff here at Veritas, we're all working together. How do we foster discipleship? And really, by discipleship, I really mean a living relationship with Christ that comes out in everything that they do. How do we foster that in the lives of our students, and what are the prerequisites for that partnership? So there might be a family listening now. We ran into a family recently from halfway across the world who is going to be coming to Veritas, we hope, because they're fans of the podcast, which kind of knocked me over, honestly. I guess the internet does go.
Pressure.
Yeah, it does go everywhere. But if you're thinking like, boy, I wonder if my family would fit into this community. If parents are sorting that out, what's kind of the prerequisites to make that partnership work well?
Can I start with something, and I'll let you two guys flesh it out, if that's all right. And I think what we've at least me and Mr. Fisher, you've been doing this for a long time, so these things are probably more instinctual for you. I've had to learn them. As I think one of the most key important components with parents is that there's trust.
Yeah.
And I think it's a trust that has to go both ways. To trust that things won't always, one thing, and Graham, you've said this, and Rachel, you've said it as well, and we've worked with different issues. You get a student in a class with 20 students, there's something different about that than at home. And parents say, well, I don't see this behavior at home. I think you're misunderstanding. That's good to hear. But then parents to hear, what do you as a pastoral team and teacher say about my child that maybe I don't understand yet?
Mm-hmm.
And be willing to go down the road a bit and trust, not that we always get it right, but trust that our perspective is actually a good perspective, a healthy perspective on the child. I know, Graham, you and I have dealt with that quite a bit.
Yeah, maybe a real super practical way to think about the question is partnership presumes that there are parts, right? There are different roles that people play. And really, at Veritas, we're assuming that the three big roles are going to be, obviously, the school is our role, but there's the role of the parents and the role of the church. And in part of what we're doing is educating kids for citizenship. And that means that they're going to, at some point in their lives, be citizens. And that means they're going to have their own families. They're going to have, be making their own decisions about what school to send their children to. And so in that process, we're partnering with these three things, right? We're partnering directly as much as possible with the parents, probably indirectly to some extent with churches. The challenge, of course, is seeing how these three things fit together. Mm-hmm. And I think what's increasingly difficult, I know this is sort of a segue to another question, but what's increasingly difficult is knowing how to understand that partnership, is for parents to have the right conception of how these three things fit together. And so to Dan's point about trust is sort of the glue that makes that partnership work. And there's a point at which that trust is broken and it's no longer a partnership.
Sure.
So.
Well, and on the way into it, I think, some of the things that we do as we have meetings with parents to interview them, as we send them stuff to read, they have to read about the school, is really to try to help them understand, here's the community you're walking into. Here are the values that we have. We don't want to surprise you, and really what we long for is for you to take up the oars and row in the same direction as the rest of the community, which is going to be, it's not going to be a great blessing every day for your child, but it's going to be a great blessing over 13 years for your child, or for the duration of the time that you're here at the school. What are some of the most destructive cultural ideas concerning discipline that you all see in the lives of families now? And I will say this for all of you out in the moon or Mars or Korea or wherever you're listening to this program, having visited many schools all over the country, we have a wonderful group of families here at Veritas. We don't know how good we have it many times. Veritas in Lancaster County, it's a great place, but I always tell people everything that's bad that you see out in the world will come here eventually. Yeah. So what are some of the ideas that you see that maybe are most destructive to children on the disciplinary front in these days?
I would say there's a book written by Philip Reif, who's one of the inspirations for the rise and triumph of the modern self, Carl Trueman. It's called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Reif says that we are presently living in a culture. His point of triumph of the therapeutic isn't, yay, the therapeutic has triumphed, but that we live in a culture dominated by the therapeutic. And I think one of the really difficult questions for parents increasingly is, where is the line where something is not productive for my child's health, but destructive? And so, obviously the bar was set much higher in the past, and that bar has been set much lower. So I think one really difficult challenge, especially for younger parents in our culture who are very, what you might call trauma sensitive, is not understanding the biblical pattern for how God matures us. Mm-hmm. An extreme example of this, we just had our school play, is Betsy in the hiding place. And the point of the play is there is no place so deep where God's love isn't deeper.
Yeah.
But if you think about what Betsy's saying, is that in every situation, God has provided the grace necessary for us to flourish.
My grace is sufficient for you, as the scripture would say.
Right. And Paul actually says, I'm thankful that God sent me a thorn. Why did he send me this thorn? He sent me this thorn so that I could flourish. My pride was an obstacle to my flourishing, and he sent this thorn so that I could flourish. So I think one of the really difficult things is that our culture is setting the bar for what constitutes trauma. And I think that the biblical pattern is much higher than where our culture has set it.
So basically, Graham, what you're saying is the Bible, we're playing with words, and what we're doing is we're redefining what the Bible says about trauma, so that a lot of kids our parents are looking at their child as a victim of trauma in a way, and there's some books out about this now, and I was listening to a podcast where someone was talking about this, and they were saying that how much or how well children in Europe after World War II recovered from the the most destructive war in the history of mankind, and the kids were okay. Generally. Now, and not every kid, or not, I'm not trying to say there wasn't anything bad that happened, because certainly, terrible things happened. We just had a play about this, right? About, Nazi concentration camps and stuff. But in general, the kids they weren't broken for the rest of their lives. They became healthy adults.
And I think it's interesting, there's a feedback loop. If you tell children, if you make them themselves trauma sensitive, they'll set that line really low. And I'm going to give kind of a funny analogy from running. If you've ever run before, and maybe you ran in high school or college, and you stop running, and you're 40 years old and you start running again. And that first mile, your brain screams at you and says, "Stop! Stop it now! You are going to die." Yeah. and then you realize
that is what my brain says. Thank you. Right. Thank you for putting words behind that.
You push through, and then, a week later, you realize, no, I'm not going to die. I can make it up this hill. And your brain really is telling you, stop. And you have to push through that. It's interesting that part of the resilience is children discovering their own resilience. Mm-hmm. So that feedback loop, if you tell them you can't do this, you can't handle that, unfortunately what happens is they don't discover their own resilience. Yeah. Now, of course, the customer service announcement here is, yes, there is real trauma. Yes. We're not denying the reality of trauma, and obviously there is a real need for therapy given real trauma. But I think that the biggest challenge is that the biblical pattern of discipline it just doesn't say that punitive discipline is discipline. It also says hardship is discipline. God uses the ordinary hardships of our lives to discipline us. Mm-hmm. And that's a grace, because we discover our own resilience.
So we've got this idea that's destructive, like the therapeutic playing out in parenting. Any other ideas that you see really being harmful? There were a couple that I had thought of, but
I thought of one, and it goes to that, and I'm actually interested in hearing Rachel, because one of the things, and sorry, I'm asking for a segue before I just say what I'm thinking, but is parents who oftentimes don't realize there are that kind of counseling that's needed and try to paper over deep problems, and we've seen that as well. So it's the opposite end of the spectrum. But I think one of the funny ones, and this is interesting this year I've seen, is that there is a tendency of a lot of parents to first believe the student's perspective on things. And so a 6-year-old gets very upset about something, and then the parent asks the student, what's going wrong in the class? And what oddly happens is we turn young students into evaluators and assessors, where they're now trying to figure out what's going wrong in the class, and then their opinion is, I don't like what the teacher's doing. And so sooner or later you have this young child who is really tasked with this very heavy burden of making sure they solve all the problems in the class. And I've had some parents talking about this, the whole class is going wrong, and this, but you've got one kid's perspective, and whether the class is or isn't, the problem is you've got this kid now in anxiety because their responsibility is to constantly report on everything going off in the class and with the teacher. Yeah. And that just doesn't create a healthy growth for the student. It builds up a lot of anxiety sometimes in our young students.
Well, it's actually, there's a book I'm reading through called Critical Biblical Theory. It's not so much about critical theory. It's really about why you should want Christianity to be true. And I think sometimes we, especially Bible-believing Christians, we have a view of truth that doesn't really take everything into account scripturally. The book points out that many times we say, okay, there is truth and falsehood, that's true. But when the Bible talks about truth, it's not saying that there aren't a number, it's a multi-perspectival truth. Now, human perspectives can never exhaust. Only God can have that multi-perspectival way that sees everything. But he points out God didn't just give us one gospel. Yeah. He gave us 4 gospels, and some of them tell the exact same story, but they don't tell it with the exact same words. Yeah. So is John lying? Did Mark just get half information? The way that we really experience truth is very different than just saying, as I had a parent say once, are you saying that my child is a liar? And I'm like, well, maybe, but what I'm really saying is they're just not seeing all of the truth.
Right.
I think that's a big part of what we are doing in our meetings when we get together is you get one piece of information, and then again, back to the concept of trust, the parents have to trust that we are kind of taking the bird's eye view and looking at everything involved, and that we will look into a situation and try to see what's going on and find the truth.
So there was one, and this is maybe a two-parted thing that I wanted to throw out there. In the life of our school currently, we just had a speaker in that was talking about investment and business and the kind of risk tolerance that it takes to be a good investor. And he was talking, he's not involved in venture capital, right? Because he said, if you get involved in venture capital, you have to know that 50% of your investments are going to zero. You are going to lose 50% of the time, and you're going to lose a lot of money. Yeah. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to win over there in a way that makes all of it make sense. He said, that's not me. He said, I'm involved in private equity. He runs a company that invests in buying companies. He said, I'm involved in private equity, and I lose sometimes, but most of the time we win. We don't win like that, though, but we don't lose either. There are some real challenges to discipleship that I think fall on the other side of the ledger. If we have a student who is defiant, it's a little bit easier. Sometimes it's not easy to see, but many times it is easy to see. If we have a student that is violent, usually somebody goes, hey, he hit me, but what do we do pastorally to encourage students to have, I kind of stopped him when he was talking about that and said, students, you need to listen to this. If you're going to accomplish anything meaningful, you have to embrace the idea that you're going to have to fail. Yeah. You're going to have to take risks. And sometimes I worry that what another business leader said to me, I was actually trying to get him to invest in the school, and I still am trying to get him to be a donor to the school. This particular one is not yet. But he was complaining that, I said, what's the biggest problem with Christian education? And I was expecting him to say low academic standards, or, they are Christian in name only. And he said, they just make compliant children. And I was like, oh my. He said, he's not against kids complying to righteous authorities, but he's saying really what we just teach kids at Christian schools is to be nice.
Yeah, I think, Ty, on that point, the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, one of the terms that the authors coined is safetyism.
Yes.
And so, related to the idea of the trauma issue is the idea of parents trying to create a safety bubble for their children. And So I think what's interesting is
And we train teachers here at Veritas to follow kids around with pillows.
We do.
So that if they're going
Bubble
to
wrap.
fall,
We're
we jump.
modernizing.
Yeah.
Ty, we're modernizing.
Yeah.
Bubble
so
wrap.
there's sort of an Edwardian adventure spirit that, Shackelford and Antarctica or the North Pole, which one was it? I can't remember. North Pole, whatever. But anyway, just that sort of adventuring spirit. And I think you could see how a culture that loses that sort of Edwardian adventuring spirit, that exploring, what happens is parents can be so governed by fear that their children can't mature.
Yes.
So another part of maturity is that it's okay. Like in a disciplinary situation, we'll have parents who think one demerit is the end of the universe. And I learned most of what I learned through failure and the process of restoration that occurs after discipline.
Yeah.
And so the idea that discipline is normative, it's kind of like the idea that if you're going to learn to ride a bike, you're going to fall.
Yeah.
Scraping your knee is normative. And so if scraping your knee is normative, and part of riding a bike is scraping your knee, and riding a bike is a glorious thing to do. I don't know if you guys remember that first time.
Oh, boy.
You're riding your bike. Or the first time you took your hands off the handlebars. Woo!
I still do not take my hands off.
You're missing out, Ty. You're missing out.
Ty's had some serious bike accidents.
I have.
But there is something to be said for that you can't get to the top of the mountain without overcoming that fear of heights, that fear of what, I don't know, am I going to hit a ridge that's too narrow? And so I do think that there are certain joys in life that only come through that sort of adventuring spirit. And so to be able to see in a culture that we would say is dominated not only by being trauma sensitive, but by safetyism, I think parents have to constantly check themselves. Am I not allowing my child to learn lessons that come from hardship, but also that just come from failure, from things not working out quite the way you wanted them to?
Yeah.
Life isn't going to be paint by numbers.
Yes.
That's a very biblical idea that God says to Abraham, go somewhere, and I'm not going to tell you where. Just start walking. And you can imagine Abraham saying, no map? Can you give me, are there going to be robbers along the way?
What about a prospectus?
Right.
How has this investment gone over the last 75 years?
Right.
Can I add to that? Because I think that to tie those two things together, maybe Ty, this is one of the things you were asking was, do we create niceness? And sometimes in the Christian culture you can, because you can prioritize, right, just moral obedience. But I think where those two things, safetyism and that agree, are sometimes the job of the student to be good is to avoid doing bad things, right? A good student is one that never gets a demerit. As if somehow the demerit is the problem. And then the parents get upset, hey, you didn't read the rule right because they got, the point is not the demerit. And I always want to say to kids, I'm not saying this, Mr. Fisher, so please don't.
Yeah.
I would say the day you become a freshman in high school, everybody gets a demerit. It's done, it's happened, you can see that it's not
No
that big a deal.
injustice there, Dan.
No, none whatsoever. I'm not going to do it. But the point is that I think when discipline is not about discipline is about maturity and growth. So if what happens with kids, you're saying, you're a good kid if you don't get discipline, it's entirely the wrong way to see it. And this is what I tell students, and I've had a couple that have come to me and done really bad things. And they come to my office and I say, why are you here? And they say, Dr. Spanjer, I am sorry. I said, to me, that's all the character I needed. You did something wrong, which you all do, but then you saw it as an opportunity to repent and grow. That is really good nutrition in your life. Now, another kid says, you did this wrong, and said, well, that's not, you didn't read it right because, and now I'm not sure that, and so the point is
we graduate them to
growth.
law school at that point.
Good lawyers. But the point is that, and I think this is what Graham read at the beginning, discipline in that sense is actually the thing that you need, not the thing to be avoided. And I think where the safetyism and this niceness sort of interact with one another is where the discipline, the pain of it is the thing, if you're a good kid, you'll never have happened to you. That's just not true in any of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think kind of going alongside also with that and also with what Graham was saying about pain, I think in our culture today, a lot of students and parents don't like the idea of uncomfortable feelings. And students, even in discipline, that's uncomfortable to be called out on something. It's uncomfortable when you are asked to write a thesis. The things that you go through in that process. I think we keep the bar pretty high here academically, and there are a lot of ways students are stretched, and discomfort is going to be part of that process. And I think parents need to also show that they're okay with that discomfort, because when a parent says, I don't like my student feeling this way, and they have the tendency to want to rescue them, that's not going to result in student growth and them becoming the adult that they need to be.
Yeah, how long do you want to rescue them? You want to rescue them.
That's just
like
a pattern.
When they get a bad job evaluation when they're 40 years
when
old.
When they realize every time something's uncomfortable, mom and dad step in, then that becomes expected. I don't have to deal with life. I can't find solutions to my own problems because my mom or dad are going to make a call, or they're going to fix this. They're going to make this assignment go away, or the discipline go away.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be the adults that we want in society.
It's like the first step down the road to learned helplessness.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it happens when you're young. If you think, like I always notice with kids, and I've noticed a little different in parenting, and this could just be me generalizing, but you'll see a kid get hurt, and the kid like looks at mom and dad like, am I in pain or not? And then the mom or dad, oh, I'm so sorry. And then the kid, oh, I am hurt. Right? And then
they need to have my wife deal with them at that point. She's got no...
Yeah, they're going to mirror their parents' reaction.
Right, and so it's really funny when I've had some kids do dumb things or get in trouble, and the parents go, you're okay. And the kid goes, oh, okay, well, how do I get over this? Or the parents go, this is terrible. And the kid goes, oh, no, this is terrible. Like you can model for them their resilience that... you fell down and hurt yourself. You're okay. You're going to be tight. You're going to be okay, buddy. Oh, am I okay not to be upset about this?
Rub some dirt
Perfectly
on
fine.
it.
Yeah.
Rub some dirt on it.
If you're not going to cry about it, it's okay. You're fine. If you want to cry,
Yeah.
that's fine. But I don't need to encourage that you react rightly. Like you got to be as emotional as I would be right now.
Yeah.
You're okay.
Well, and now, I never thought this question would be a culturally provocative question, but we have two kinds of students here at Veritas, and it's not good students and bad students. I'm talking about boys and girls. Now, those, as a pastoral team, you probably remember these antiquated words of boys and girls. It's before we learned.
Picture for me?
Yeah, no. It's used to be about science, but now it's about feelings. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. But so how are boys and girls' needs for discipleship maybe different? And I know that I'm asking you to stereotype, and I'm not saying that all of these stereotypes would necessarily be true for every student, but the reasons that there are stereotypes is because oftentimes they're true for a lot of students. So talk with me a little bit about how we might treat boys, or how boys and girls have different discipleship needs along the way.
Yeah, that is a great question, Ty, and I'd love to say that we could give something really definitive here because it is also cultural. But I think if you look at the way boys tend to respond, and I think we've talked about this before, boys tend to be, it's almost the light needs to be a lot brighter, the sound needs to be louder. Some kids are very sensitive to that, but boys tend not to pay attention to emotional things, and so sometimes you need to be very direct in what's considered a harsh way to get a student to, and I think sometimes when boys are not treated that way, then they actually don't hear the correction, because you want to say, I want to do this in a way that's emotionally sensitive to the boy. And the boy's like, emotions, what does that mean? Where sometimes something that considered very harsh to a girl is not at all harsh to a boy. My daughter, who's here, decided they were going to compliment all their friends every day as a way of loving one another. And so with the girls, they had beautiful hair, and I love your shirt. She said, we weren't doing it with the boys. And I said, well, what did you do for the boys? She said, we decided to say, we like your shoes, and aren't those? And I said, no, you're all off. They don't care about that necessarily. They want to know they're brave. They want to know they're courageous, something much blunter and much more direct about them.
All you're telling them is they picked out the clothes that were on the top in the drawer.
Or mom said, wear this.
Yeah, mom laid out my clothes. I put them on.
Thanks.
Goodness
for
But when you say to a girl, hey, those were their shoes, they infer all the things that mean from them. They take that really serious. That's a really fine compliment to be made. And a boy's like, what? Do I have shoes on? I don't remember putting them on this morning.
Yeah, Ty, to be a little provocative, we have a female pastor on our pastoral team here.
Again,
sorry,
It's
Rachel.
the pastoral team.
Yeah. Church office.
No, but Rachel, one of the things we intentionally have done is there are conversations that we say, this is a conversation that Rachel needs to have with our young ladies. Or there's a conversation that might be more particularly me with our young men. And I would say, just an example of a very common girl problem is gossip. So there will be a lot of drama that's occurring, and it's not classic discipline. It's not like it's just black and white discipline, obvious discipline, and somebody needs to get in there and help them through. An adult needs to come in and help them to navigate that issue. And I think what's interesting about what we do is a lot of what we're doing is trying to remove the obstacles to flourishing. And so in the classroom, for girls, it's going to be the accumulated history of things, maybe hurtful things that have been said, things that have been said that, are intended to hurt, ways that false information has been spread. And those things are very hard to discipline. They're often heart issues that don't, you'll have the guys come into your office and they were fighting out at recess, and then you say, hey guys, shake hands. And they vigorously shake hands and they leave the office with a big smile on their face. Whereas some of these issues with the young ladies have been, 3 years have been festering.
Yeah, they're so connected to everything. I used to say to people, or I still say to them, boys tend to be moved by forces and girls tend to be moved by feelings. So when Dan said the discipline might look harsh for a boy and gentle for a girl, I think that harshness, I don't want people to misread that. I think boys, the thing just has to be direct.
We're clear.
And
right?
even
that's
like,
right.
You did this, now this happens. Okay? You did it. I'm not sitting at home fuming about you, but you did this. Now you pay the price. Yeah. Whereas, I've been in rooms with parents where they're trying to get their boys, especially middle school boys, to feel, to understand what their actions did in this connected web to other people. And you can just see this look of bafflement on the young man's face. Be much better off to say, you did this, here's the consequence.
It's wrong.
It's wrong. Don't do it again. Right. You did this, and here's the consequence. And if you do it again, the consequence is going to be X plus 10.
Right.
And a lot of, at that point, I see, like, okay, I got that. I got that.
They understand.
That I can understand. Right. Whereas, I remember talking with some public school family members, actually, and I was joking around with them, and I said, hey, what we really need to do is to make boys be girls. And one of them said, you're right. That's it. And I'm like, no, that's not it. But we have such a negative view of masculinity in our culture that what we want them to do is to, what did Lewis say? We castrate and then bid the gelding be fruitful, right? We want men without chests, and then we find that we're shocked when we find we have traitors in our midst.
Yeah. Abolition of man.
Yeah.
Real quickly on this point, I think this is where Rachel is so incredibly valuable. What we do as a pastoral team, a lot of what we do is what we sometimes think of as the soft stuff, which is why we called ourselves the pastoral team. But there are things that involve the heart. And what I think...
So pastoral equals soft?
I
want to make sure that every pastor that's out there listening,
right.
Graham is just calling you soft.
Yeah, sorry. But I think one thing that's interesting, especially with girls, and this is where parents need to be careful, is that I have 4 boys and 1 girl. I don't have a single one of my boys who comes home and talks about the drama of the day. Oh. So, and I'm not saying there aren't boys who do. And
Graham,
so
if you need help,
come
over.
Ty has 4 girls, so
we'll switch families.
But what's interesting though is that activity is very normal and natural, and parents have to recognize that there's a way to parent your daughter in the midst of that processing the day that is really helpful, but also to use the school, to use the tools of the teacher in the classroom, to use Rachel, to use this team to help navigate some of that. Because the problem that you often have as a young lady is trying to navigate. She's maybe got a tool she doesn't quite know how to use yet. She's reading the room and she's coming home and saying, here's what my day is like. And moms panic when they hear that because they see their daughters panic. How do I work through this? And that's not typical normal discipline. That's not, demerits and, send the kid on his way and learn the lessons of life. There's actually a lot of conversation that has to occur around those things and helping them not to continually find themselves in ruts. I'm sure, Rachel, you probably have something to add to this.
Yeah, I think with girls, it again comes frequently back to that discomfort, either on the one side when you find out you thought you were being funny. We talk about that a lot. Like, oh, they thought they were being funny. Oops, that was actually really offensive. And the boys do that too. But that discomfort at realizing, like, maybe it's a one-on-one with me and I say, hey, I heard that you said this, and do you remember that? Or, oh man, really? Like, yeah, I did say that. I didn't mean it that way, or I did. But then the realization that you did hurt somebody, and then, okay, what do you want to do about that? And how can we make it right? Do you want to make that right? So it's, again, that discomfort. And also on the flip side, for the recipients who sometimes come and say, I've been hurt, then to sit with that feeling of like, oh, I'm so, yeah, that's really painful. I'm sorry that was said to you. Also then evaluating, do you think they meant it? Do you think they were trying to hurt you? All that nuance. And then figuring out, how do we find restoration between the two parties? And it takes a lot of time, and it has to be done very carefully.
Yeah, and I want to make sure everybody gets it out there in podcast land. It's not that we're content with the innate state of boys. We know that in a society that only continues because there are two sexes, eventually we're headed towards something where guys need to gain emotional intelligence. Maybe these middle school guys that when you say, do you think you hurt someone? And they say, there are other people. Like, I just think of food and
Pizza.
myself. And then girls that sometimes are everything is so connected, but they're not reading things well. Eventually, they're going to be adults who are going to have spouses, who are going to have children, who are going to work with people of the opposite sex, and they have to learn how to be a well-rounded whole person. But you use that word restoration. Why is that word so important in the disciplinary setting here at Veritas Academy?
Well, since I was just talking about the girls, the first thing that comes to my mind is we are a very small school and no one's going anywhere. So
not as small
that's
as
one
we
of the
used to
things.
be.
That's true. That's true. But my first practical thought is, I'm just thinking of situations with my girls where they would come home and say, I was really offended that this was said, or I picked up on this body language from a friend. And I often say, does that friendship matter to you? Do you want to continue in that friendship? Because sometimes there's times where we say, you can pull back from that for a while. But frequently the answer is yes, that this girl matters to me, this relationship matters, which we're going to see later in life too, whether it is a spouse or a parent. But yeah, it does matter. And then the conversation turns to, okay, what needs to be said to make it right? I know it's uncomfortable, but if it matters, you should go to that girl and say, hey, you said this, or I felt like you treated me this way. Can we talk about it?
Right.
Because they're your friends and you're going to be here for many more years, and so are they. So let's make the best of it.
And sometimes it seems like you're a light year away from reconciliation and restoration, and really you're about an inch away.
So close. There's so many times where, the girl can be terribly offended and think the friendship is over, and then they realize, the other girl actually wants to restore this too, and they're best friends in 5 minutes. Not always, but
not always.
No, frequently students want to make things right.
Yeah.
I want to add something, because I think that's really helpful. And I think the modern culture is that restoration is not nearly as important as retribution. And I think where discipline and pastoral things can sometimes mean this word justice, which means if this situation is going to be solved, then someone needs to pay for this, as if there needs to be an equalizing. So they're offended, now they need to know, and something like that. But restoration doesn't imagine necessary retribution.
Yeah.
What it imagines is actually sometimes a person who's the offender needs to be loved, because that restoration is restored. Not, we kind of read that you're the bad kid, so somehow we gotta get some equalize the experience.
Well, and Dan, I think that another really important point, and this maybe goes back to some of the bad ideas that are loose in culture. We've used the word offend a number of times, and really here at Veritas, I want to make sure folks get a clear picture that what we're dealing with when we talk about repentance and restoration, we're talking about sin more than there are times when people can be very offended, but no sin has actually occurred. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that we need to justify people being bulls in a china shop. You can be negligent of the way you're impacting other people. Right. But we try, what we don't want to do is start down that path of playing with words. Because honestly, we have a culture that is full of what I would call, in the basketball sense, everyone's waiting to take a charge. we have a professional class of offense-taking people. They hang out on social media and take, 3 words that someone says, and they get offended by it. Well, really, the answer is, number one, you should read whole sentences. That's really helpful to find out meaning. And then secondly, God divides the actions into sin and not sin.
Right. Yeah, and Ty, real quickly on that point, I think what we would say here at Veritas is, does Christianity make a difference? Well, this is particularly where Christianity makes the biggest difference. The culture does not have the ultimate tools for restoration. The gospel
You're exactly
is the
right.
ultimate tool, right? And here's the Son of God, King of the universe, on a cross, experiencing the greatest offense in the history of the universe, right? Mocking, being spit at,
And he's innocent.
He's innocent. And yet he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Stephen, being stoned, last words, Father, just like Christ. And then, of course, we think of the Sermon on the Mount, that, there is a strength in forgiving an offense. There is a weakness in constantly taking an offense. And what our culture is telling our children is, you need to be offense sensitive, right? We call them microaggressions.
Yeah.
You need to be offense sensitive. And what the Bible's telling us is that one of your greatest paths to health is to forgive 7 times 70.
Yeah, forgive macroaggressions.
Right. Yeah, the ultimate, and Christ is our model for that. So I think one of the things that's interesting is the gospel is really the only path to peace. And again, I've always loved Betsy. I think Betsy is one of the greatest figures in literature from The Hiding Place. And this is a woman who had every reason to die with the greatest resentments. And here's a person who dies with peace.
Because of Jesus.
Because of the gospel.
Because she was following someone who had faced infinitely worse circumstances than her, who was more mistreated,
right,
who was treated with more injustice. And if the Lord suffered that, I can suffer this smaller thing. And in some ways, I can suffer it to be with him and to be like him.
Yeah, I teach Boethius, and you can see this even in MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., the idea of having an internal fortress. You have an internal strength, that the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune may assail you, and yet you have an internal strength. And for our students, that's what the gospel teaches. Not to be a justice warrior, to fight every injustice and to set the universe right by making the world just, but to imitate Christ, who experiences the greatest injustice in the history of the universe, and yet from a position of strength, says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those difficulties too. I think our parents are going to face, because they feel they're responsible. And this is what happens in the modern culture. You're responsible to make society. You got to change the world. You got to fix this. You got to be a superhero. There's just so much of that they put that burden on their children, and to say almost, you're not responsible to obey the rules unless the system is just. When the system is unjust, you need to. So you may mean you have to be loud, disobedient, disrespectful. You've got to fix the system. So you may have to rage and rampage and disrespect the teacher, but that's what's required to fix the system. And I think what the point of Christ that you both are getting at is that obedience to God is the treasure, even if the system is unjust, or even if something goes wrong, a teacher makes a mistake, or someone says something wrong. Your job is not to disobey God to fix that. Your job is to take that opportunity to obey God by obeying and respecting your teacher and your classmates. And I just think there's a lot of this justice stuff which is just infiltrating. And it sounds good because justice is good ultimately, but it's confused with obedience and righteousness, almost to the point where you're not responsible to obey unless the system is a good system.
Well, or unless the system is a perfect system,
right.
which is maybe another podcast or something like that.
Many more.
Because, that Christian wrestling with compliance to righteous authorities and a willingness to stand and to to say hard things or to live in ways that might get you in trouble. But we'll jot that down for maybe a future podcast. So Pastoral Team, thank you so much for coming in and talking about discipline and discipleship today. I am so thankful for the work that you all do, and I see the fruit and the blessings that come of that work in the lives of our students and families just about every day.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Ty.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.